everyone, my name is Bella, and today I'll be talking to you about the making of a killer. How many of you watch true crime documentaries or just tune into the evening news? Have you ever wondered what makes criminals the way they are? Well, I have, a lot. And after years of research, I've come to the conclusion that many killers and violent criminals have little to no control over their thoughts, actions, and emotions. That being said, I believe our justice system and culture is treating them unfairly. I'm a nursing major, and this has forced me to take multiple psychology and biology courses. On top of this, I have studied killers and their motives as a hobby for as long as I can remember. Throughout my years of research and school courses, I have changed my view on violent criminals greatly, and I believe you will too. I will start by telling you a little bit about genetics and their role in the making of a killer. As we all know, all living things are made up of DNA. What you may not know is that human DNA is made up of 23 pairs of chromosomes, with each chromosome carrying upwards of 1,000 genes. And genes are the segments of our DNA that are responsible for determining our physical and biochemical traits. There are multiple genes that are linked to sociopathy and violent crime, but I will be focusing on the gene called monoamine oxidase A, or MAOA. MAOA is the most studied gene that is linked to sociopathy and violent crime. MAOA degrades several neurotransmitters in the human brain, including serotonin, noradrenaline, and dopamine. Low levels of serotonin have been linked to insomnia, depression, and aggression. And dopamine controls our behavior and our reward center. People with the MAOA gene also tend to have underdeveloped limbic systems, and our limbic system is involved with emotional responses, behavior, and long-term memory. Malfunctions in the limbic system can lead to passionate, chaotic, and sometimes violent reactions in emotional situations. It also enhances the person's ability to mimic facial expressions and emotions. And if you're wondering why learning about this might matter, the Golden State Killer, whose identity was unknown for nearly 50 years, is a great example. The Golden State Killer raped 50 women, killed 13 people, and committed over 120 burglaries in his reign. He was identified as Joseph James D'Angelo in 2018, and they did this by uploading his DNA onto an ancestry site. Do you think that when his relatives found out who he really was, they did nothing? I know that if I found out I was related to him, even distantly, I'd be suggesting every test and scan I could think of. And even if I wasn't doing it for me, I would be doing it for my kids to find out what I could have possibly passed on to them. And if we can acknowledge that learning about DNA and patient education can drastically lower the rate of violent crime down the road, we can maybe start to look at these criminals as a result of a failed system rather than inherently evil. In addition to genetics, environmental factors and upbringing also affect our brains as much as these killer genes. Several studies in the early 2000s linked childhood abuse with higher scores on the sociopathic and psychopathic scales. In fact, it's almost impossible to find a serial violent criminal that hasn't had some form of childhood abuse or neglect. Typically, when a child experiences abuse or neglect, they are exposed to stressful stimuli, which initiates their fight or flight response, raising their cortisol levels. Prolonged stress and raised cortisol levels lead to halted development of the brain, particularly the limbic region, and it contrives results much like the MAOA gene. Brain scans of psychopaths have shown this to be true. Most have little activity in both the frontal lobe and limbic regions of the brain. Inactivity of the frontal lobe is linked to irrational thinking, impulsivity, and violence. It's safe to assume we all know who Ted Bundy is. He was known for his good looks, charm, and apparent normalcy. He used these skills to manipulate the people around him and gain their trust. Though we don't have a DNA profile of Bundy, we do know that the brain scans done after incarceration showed significant abnormalities. This could have been due to genetics, upbringing, or both. We know that Bundy was raised by a severely abusive grandfather and for most of his life believed his mother was his sister. When he found out the truth about his mother, he felt a betrayal so deep he could not let it go. Once apprehended, investigators noticed a startling resemblance between all of his victims and his mother. One could argue that this is an example of frontal lobe dysfunction and that hypothetically he chose women who looked like his mother as some messed up form of revenge. And Bundy wasn't the only killer known to have a history of abuse. Edmund Kemper, H.H. Holmes, Donald Gaskins, John Wayne Gacy, and Charles Manson, and many, many more could be added to the seemingly endless list. Since genetics and childhood abuse can certainly be to blame for many violent criminals, what about those who have no genetic predisposition or any history of abuse? A known example of this would be O.J. Simpson. He has no history of abuse and no known genetic markers of psychopathy, but has been regularly found, ignoring the verdict of his trial, was regularly found in brutal domestic violence cases with his wife, who was eventually killed. There's a condition called post-concussive syndrome, and the results can vary based on the severity of the injury. Frontal lobe injuries in particular have been linked with aggression and impulsivity and illogical thinking. Following frontal lobe lesions, patients are more likely to use physical intimidation, verbal threats, or actual threats in confrontational situations. Many people argue that O.J. Simpson suffered from post-concussive syndrome. You might be thinking, okay, I get it, but what am I supposed to do about it? The first thing you can do is vote. Vote about how criminals are prosecuted and sentenced. Vote to support criminal mental health institutions so these people are properly cared for. Vote for mental health institutions and access in school. All of these things have been proven to lessen crime down the road. Next, you can educate yourself. Learn about the school to prison pipeline. Learn about how ACE scores, adverse childhood experiences, affect you in adulthood. And mostly, you can just learn how to recognize signs of mental illness in the people around you. The simplest thing you can do, though, is just acknowledge your biases. I used to think about criminals like Richard Allen Davis, a man who kidnapped, murdered, and raped a 12-year-old girl, and fume. But after learning all this, I found I can fume about the abuse he likely received as much as I can about the damage he did. Most people will listen to this long list of killers and lose every bit of empathy. I've heard they deserve to die or rot in prison more times than I can count. But it has been proven time and time again that our genetics and upbringing make us who we are. Why can't we apply this logic to criminals? Just because someone has an invisible illness doesn't mean that they deserve to die or rot in prison, nor do they deserve to have no chance for rehabilitation. I ask that as a citizen, voter, juror, victim, and human, to please think of these people as just that, a human. Thank you.